Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute sessions, and our topic for this week is constants and enums, mainly constants. What is that all about? Well, the basic idea is this: don't use string literals throughout your code like this, especially if you're going to use them in multiple places. Bad things will happen if you have large code bases or multiple developers on a project. Then you will end up in problems. How do you solve it? You solve it with constants that you define once and everybody then references. You can also use enums, but I don't go into that too much in this class because it's pretty short. So we're going to talk about constants and about defining a class with constants in it to use. So let's get started. So what am I talking about when I say we should be doing enums and constants? Well, here's the thing. In this small piece of code that I've copied from elsewhere, I have these strings like what I've got highlighted here: Cisco and Juniper and Arista. And if I were to use that just one time in one piece of code and nowhere else, then it might be okay. But if I use it more than once, I'm susceptible to all kinds of things, mainly typos and issues that I might have of doing a capital letter instead of a small letter, things of this nature. And guess what? Look at how many errors that flags. It flags 0 errors because it's a string. But this code is not going to work that it's supposed to. Why won't it work? Because lowercase Cisco is not the same as uppercase Cisco. And you say, well, I could say .lower or something like that. And yeah, in general, when you're comparing strings, you can do .lower. But what if I didn't do this, but I spelled it incorrectly? Like maybe something insidious like this, where it's not really obvious that I caused the problem. I might just look at this and say, oh, that's still okay, and it doesn't work. And I stare at this and stare at this and stare at this. Now, these two things are right next to each other. Just imagine if you have 10 different files where you have this Cisco string floating around everywhere. That would be a very bad thing. Not only that, but what if you have multiple people working on the project? You can see the problem that you run into. So we want to find a way to resolve this and work around it so that we don't run into issues like I've just described. So how do we solve this string literal issue? Well, the easiest way to do it is to use constants. Now, Python does not actually have constants in the language, but you have to use things in such a manner as to treat them as constants. And so in other languages, we typically have constants be written in all caps. So we're doing that. Now, of course, as I say, Python is not going to enforce this. You have to make sure that you do that throughout your code, and anybody else on your project does that as well. If you were to do something like this, if I were to go down to the code, here's where I was using literals. I've commented that out, and now here's the code that I've replaced it with. And you can see I've gotten rid of my string literals, at least for Cisco, Juniper, and Arista, and I am using the constants instead. What does this mean? This means if I decided to change this word to be capitalized, then it would be capitalized everywhere. If I decided to change it to be the official name, then I would change it here and it would be reflected everywhere in the code, and everything would work fine because everything is referencing this constant that I have defined. That's the basic idea. So that's the first way to do it. Now, the problem with this is if you have a large project, you may have other places where you want to have something called Cisco or Juniper or Arista or whatever, and you may end up with issues with that, especially if the name or the word happens to be a common one. So is there another way to do this? And the answer is yes. And I'm going to comment these out and uncomment the code that does it. That will be by using a class. Looks like I seem to have done that okay. Let's just run it to make sure it's okay. Yeah, looks good. So what have I done here? let's go back up to my definition. What I've done is I've defined a class called vendor, but this class is really not going to serve the purpose of an object-oriented type class where we're going to instantiate stuff, but rather I am just defining these variables that are going to be part of the class, and then I can refer to Cisco as vendor.cisco and to Juniper as vendor.juniper, and we'll see this down in the code. So here's my code, and you can see I've got vendor.cisco. Now it's a little bit more wordy, and so you may or may not like this, but the advantage is if you had some other type of piece of code that actually wanted to use something called Cisco but with a different value, or if it was a word that was more common, then your class name here first, vendor dot, helps to distinguish it and points Python at the actual definition of this constant within the vendor class. And so that is the way you would do it using this class definition of constants. Now, enums are a more advanced construct, and I'm not going to go through them in this class. You can look at the long form of this week's lesson if you want to learn more about them. I don't see a whole lot of value in using them in this situation because I prefer to keep it simple, but you can define enums. Then when you reference the name, you need to do this whole thing, and if you want to reference the value, you can do that. And here, of course, you can store numbers as the actual values, or you can have your strings. But again, it's serving the same purpose as the constant was, and the constant is a little bit simpler, so that's what I tend to use. Okay, so what did we talk about in this short lesson? We talked about how it's a bad idea to do string literals or constants throughout your code because it will introduce errors, or at least make the possibility of errors in the form of typos or spelling in one way or another. My example here is pretty simple because they're right next to each other. In a real world example, you'll have multiple references throughout a much larger code base, and you may even have multiple people working on it. So how do you work around that without using string literals? There's one way to do it, which is just to define constants. So here you can see I've defined constants that I can then reference, and you define it once and it's good for everybody. So that's one way to do it. Another way that makes it a little bit more definitive what you're doing is to define a class and have your constants within a class. So then you can say vendor.cisco and use that throughout your code, or vendor.juniper, etc. I mentioned enums. I didn't go into them, but you can look at the long form in order to learn more. So please don't use string literals in your code. I see this all the time. It's one way to tell people, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not really a programmer of any note. So don't do that. Use constants or enums or something of that form in order to avoid the problems that I mentioned. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for listening.